Accessing library computer data.
So this is the unboxing ceremony of the episode. So one thing you can tell about this box, it is the latest re-release of the Enterprise D model. In fact, it's the 50th anniversary re-release, and what makes this re-release so special compared to the previous incarnations of this model is that they remade this using clear plastic. I think they saw the need finally to actually do that, because they realised so many model makers out there wanted to light these beautiful models up from the inside out. And back in the olden days, I had to, like many people out there, had to get a drill and get a knife and cut every single window we wanted to illuminate out from this hard plastic. It was messy and it didn't look great at all. So now they've actually made the plastic clear, which allows us to mask these windows off, paint, and then unmask them, and it's easy. So this is the one you want to get hold of if you want to be able to light up your model with little effort but with maximum impact. So look out for this. Now, I bought this a couple of years ago, and even back then it was so a couple of years ago, I think that was 2016-17, this cost me £70. It cost me quite a lot of money. I think you might be able to get it cheaper, but they do re-release these from time to time. But I made sure I got my one ASAP. Now, I've already opened this up before, and it's just been sitting on my shelf for the last couple of years for me to make a video like this. So the first thing you see is this display stand. Now, as you can see, it's like a dome. It's not particularly great compared to the previous incarnations of the Enterprise D model which was released. It used to be the Delta symbol from Star Trek, and now they just made it a black dome. It's not great. I think they might have realised actually people want to make their own display stands, so why bother? One thing that they have done, they've added a few more inches to the height of how you can display your model. So before you could only display your model so many inches above the desk. Now I would say that's about 5, 6, perhaps even 7 inches with the display stand. So that's kind of cool. But we won't be using that. We'll be doing something very special much later on in the build. Now, as you can see, every part is clear. It's essentially exactly the same model from all the previous incarnations of the Enterprise D model, but remolded in clear plastic. I don't know if it's particularly easy to see on the camera, but there you go. It's clear plastic. They've kept many of the inaccurate lines and textures on the actual model itself, but we're going to go into that later on, because we're going to remove all that texture because that's inaccurate, because the original model didn't have that. It was a flat spray paint. It was a flat paint job on top of it. So we're going to get rid of that later on. So you'll have the secondary hull or the primary hull. People call it different things, but I would say that's the engineering hull to myself. There's some warp engine parts here, warp nacelles. There's the instructions. It's such an easy model to make. I doubt we'll ever be touching these instructions at all. As you can see, great big pieces, not that hard at all. Advertising, battle bridge, and the second part to the engineering deck. And here we go, the unrecognisable great big oval saucer section. With all that detail we need to start filling in later on. Now this is going to take a lot of time to work on. Now, one of the important things I like to focus on in this model kit, now I bought 2 of these model kits, one between 2 re-releases, and one thing I noticed was the decals were different. So let me just move this out of the way. There was 2 sets of decals, and this is what I got. So one set was this. There we go, very unusual. So you paint your model one flat colour, and then you apply the decals across the entire model. Now, I've seen a few model makers that have done this, and you know what, from a distance it looks fine, but when you get close up, decals leave a sheen to them, they crinkle, and you know what, when it comes down to it, you cannot be painting. You have to paint if you want to get a really good result. But these are great for first timers or people who just want to quickly make their model and just have it being displayed on their desk. However, we won't be using this, but we might use this in a way to make our own stencils. So you've got a lot of these, but one thing I do love about these decals is that it gives you all the decals for the lifeboats, and they're so detailed you can actually see the numbers. Don't know if you can see it, the numbers of each lifeboat. The detail is immense. I'm going to go into such geekness that I'm going to look at my Blu-ray player and I'm going to see if I can match up some of these lifeboat hatches to where they should be on the model. But that is the last stage of making that model, so we've got some time yet. And the next lot of decals are this. So let me just say, I think this was the first release of this model when it was made into a clear plastic, and they didn't give you the Aztec pattern. What they gave you was just the basic. There you go, just the basic decals, what you kind of had when you back in the 90s when they first made this model. The difference being that they've given you all the lifeboats. That's fantastic. I love the detail here. Incredible effort has gone into this. So yeah, take care of your decals. Whatever you do, keep them, always get mixed up with the sides, keep them covered up, away from dampness. Obviously don't put them on top of a heater, and you want to keep them dry. So that's it for the unboxing. Before making the model, we need to prepare the surface. Now, as you can see, this particular kit has raised lines. Now, the original studio model did not have raised lines. In fact, the Aztec pattern was painted on, and the only texture you really had was the lines which were engraved into the plastic itself in these sections here, 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 and here. And also it had indents for the windows, and we want to keep those as well. Now, many model makers would actually grab hold of some sandpaper and rub this down. Now, there's a risk there, because if you rub down too much, you'll end up making the windows disappear, as well as a few other bits and pieces which are critical for the detail of the model which you want to keep. Otherwise it's going to be a headache to actually put back later. My tip, which I learned when I worked at an architectural model makers, was a Stanley knife. Yes, I know, it's kind of weird. We are going to use a Stanley knife blade to do the work better and more efficiently than sandpaper in this particular situation. Now, bear with me on this. You want to go in one direction, up, down, or down to up, and I will stop talking in between because it does get a bit noisy. So okay, so you can't actually see too well there because let me just zoom in, but that texture's gone now. Within a couple of strokes it's kept the windows and it's kept the grooves for the sections, but it's completely taken away the raised lines. Now, this is perhaps the quickest, cleanest and easiest way to actually prepare the surface of this model. Now, I don't even have to use sandpaper. I might go with sandpaper later on, just because of paint preparation, but other than that, as you can see, that took me a couple of seconds. Now, if you sanded that, you'd have to use different types of grades of sandpaper and it would take you forever. However, get yourself one of these and just scrape like so. Done. And keep on going. Done. There you go. Beautiful. Completely smooth. I might go over these section lines with a scriber later, but they're still quite good. Even though this is a quick method, it's going to take a while because there's a lot of big pieces to go through, and I have to be careful not to actually damage all the lovely detail which is already there. So bear with me. Okay, here's a little tip for you when sanding or scraping. Get yourself an apron. This is actually great for catching all that dust and crud which comes off your model, because last thing you want is having it all over your trousers and you're walking through the house and you're going to spread all that rubbish everywhere. See, this is good for housekeeping, this video, as well as making your Enterprise D model. One thing I do emphasize about this model, the amount of preparation you need to do. So just when I thought I'd finished, I realized there's a couple more things I needed to do to make the surface ready. Now, depending on what brass etching you get, and when I say brass etching, a lot of models, they come with accurate parts, or not, they don't come with accurate parts, but you can buy aftermarket parts which are brass etched. Essentially what it looks like is this, and I'll actually do a close-up just right now. And as you can see with the brass etching, it's incredibly accurate. I'm not going to go into the process how these companies make it, but one thing I realised with this particular brass etch set, it says in the instructions right here that the phaser bank strips, which are an incredibly raised detail on this model, it has to be scraped off or sanded off. And so I'm having to go around the entire model and scrape off the phaser bank strips. And this is when using my technique of the Stanley blade will just save you so much time. Just scrape it off and then you sand it. And get yourself a sanding block, and not just any sanding block. This is a cork sanding block, many of you are familiar with, but the problem is with a cork sanding block, it's very brittle and it does not bend. And when you're actually preparing curved surfaces like on the Enterprise D, you want to have something like this. It's like a sponge. They actually sell this because obviously the cars are generally curved, and when you sand them for to try and eliminate rust and preparing the surface for paint, this is a great tool to use. Essentially it's just a piece of foam, and it's actually got a grain of, I think this is 800 wet and dry on this, but then you just cut yourself your own wet and dry, whatever grade it is, wrap it round the sponge and then sand away. Actually, that's another tip. You could probably get hold of a sponge if it's dense enough, but this is only like what, $1, £1, so recommend this. Now to carry on. And that is the last part of the model prepared, well, the surface anyway. This was a long and laborious task. It took me around about 3 to 4 sessions. Each session was about an hour to an hour and a half. After work, coming in, sitting down after having dinner and just rubbing away watching YouTube. Yes, it takes time. You have to have patience. If you find yourself getting a bit irritated and you're rushing it, stop, walk away, play a computer game, do something, but do not work on the model any further, because the last thing you want to do is end up damaging the surface or rushing it, and you get to the very end of the model making process and finding out actually when you painted it, you've kind of destroyed the surface. So take your time. Now, the process that I used, as you saw, I used a Stanley knife blade to scrape off the excess, but yes, I did have to eventually sand. But you have to do that anyway because you need to key off the surface area so it's fit for painting. And yes, way ahead of myself now. We're not going to paint until the very last stage of making this model. However, do it at this stage, and the reason why I say that is because you see how vigorous it is to sand down a model. Last thing you want to do is have that model all together, so electronics inside, and as you've seen with the Enterprise D model, it's actually quite a big model, and it's going to be awkward for you to actually get that ready for paint, and you don't want dust going inside the model, covering up the bits which are meant to be see-through. So do it at this stage. So this is when I actually had to use wet and dry paper. Now there are different gradients of wet and dry. So the very high number, each one's got a number. Very high number is means that it's less coarse, and the lower the number means it's really coarse, almost like the same sandpaper you put at the bottom of the cage of if you've got a budgie. So I used, what was it? I used 400 wet and dry first. After I used the scraper, I used the 400 to get off any other really big pieces of plastic which were sticking out, which I didn't need. And then I went over it, so 400 to 800, did that, the entire model, and then down to 1200, and then that made it really smooth. And so now you should have like a nice milky texture to your model, and that's what you're aiming for, and it's smooth and everything's where it should be. You still got your windows, and you've got rid of those nasty raised lines that I wish they'd take them off. If they ever remade this model, amongst many things they should improve on this, is get rid of that texture detail. Just keep the stuff which is indented. There we are for the preparation of the surface area of the Enterprise D. I wish we had Q here and he could have just gone and just made it all happen. However, blood, sweat and tears makes you appreciate the model even more at the very end. It's all about the time and effort you put into it. So in the next episode we are going to be focusing on accurate parts. Now accurate parts, if I can pronounce it properly, lots of models aren't produced with the greatest of detail, and especially models which are made up from designs which haven't been released yet. So more often than not with sci-fi models, just when they're making the studio model, they'll give the plans to the manufacturers to make the kits for fans, and with the Enterprise D, you'll probably notice if you're an avid Star Trek Next Generation fan, there's certain details which are missing on this model. However, thankfully, model makers are grateful to companies who make third-party parts or aftermarket parts. They've got different names for them. So they will make supplementary parts, accurate parts, to be able to add to your model and make it exactly the way it should be. And so we're going to concentrate on that on the next episode, which will take some time, and there's a lot of those parts which will correct this model. You don't realise how inaccurate this model actually is until you see what's out there on the internet, but I'll give those links on the next episode. Anyway, I'm going to start vacuum cleaning now. I'm covered in this dust, and you take care. Captain John Child signing out. Live long and prosper.
Library computer data.